Hello everyone. So I'm making this video to discuss something a little bit different than usual. So I'm going to start a new playlist, a new series of videos about hypotheses. But let me give a brief introduction. So usually the videos I make are about stories, the assumptions, the beliefs that we have that lead to an imagined reality that then we project on top of the actual reality, and then we compare actual reality with imagined reality, and this produces a judgment, and this judgment makes us suffer. And I'm arguing, also from personal experience, that basically what enlightenment is can also be called the dropping of the conditioned mind, dropping the conditionings, blah, 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 is really just realizing that the stories are just stories. It's just this. There is nothing mystical, there is nothing magical, there is no truth to find. It's like the truth is more in removing what is false. And what is false is the stories in our mind that we tell ourselves, that then create this imagined reality, and then we compare the reality with the imagined reality, we judge the reality, and then we feel suffering. That's it. It's nothing incredibly complicated. I mean, it's not easy to do. It requires some ability to do self-inquiry, self-analysis, introspection, etc. But it's nothing supernatural, let's say. There is nothing magical about it. So my argument is that it's kind of difficult to try to make a hypothesis, to try to imagine something that is, unless you have removed the stories. Because while you have the stories in your mind, you keep having those imagined realities everywhere, and it's very difficult to think clearly because, first of all, we have those stories which we kind of believe in. That's why we judge, because when we compare the reality with our imagined reality, we kind of believe that our imagined reality is, if not real, at least possible. And we can have many stories, and they can also contradict each other. So it's very, very difficult to think clearly as long as you have those stories. Once you drop the stories, so let's say you have removed what is false, you have removed the conditioning, you have removed the stories, then you can start to think in a more clear way, in a more open way, and you can start to maybe formulate hypotheses. And there is no truth here. The best we can do is formulate hypotheses based on what makes sense, what seems to be most logical, specific experience that we have. We can start to formulate hypotheses. So I will just start with some hypotheses. And again, those are just hypotheses, and really, hypothesis is as good as it gets. So the process is removing what is obviously wrong, like the stories. Once you have removed what is obviously wrong, then you can start to formulate hypotheses, and eventually you may realize that they are wrong or partially wrong, or you may make a more accurate hypothesis later. Really, the hypothesis eventually will be probably replaced with more accurate hypotheses, or some experimental data will either confirm them or disconfirm them. But they are just hypotheses, so we are not trying to build new stories here. That's why I insist in calling them hypotheses. We are just building hypotheses. So once we have cleared our mind from the stories, and we have reached a point where there is no stories going on in our head, then we can start to make hypotheses. So much as being said about life, death, the afterlife, blah, 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 blah. But it's mostly stories. The truth is, no one really knows. And in general, if we know something, we know just a little bit. For sure, no one knows everything. This is ridiculous. That's why anyone that uses the words absolute or like truth or whatever is just bullshit. When you hear it, run away. But let's try to formulate our first hypothesis. It's a very simple hypothesis, which, again, maybe it's wrong, maybe it's right. It is just an hypothesis, and we can think about it. We can see if we find other hypotheses that will contradict with this one. We can see if there is going to be some experimental data that is going to contradict it or confirm it. But again, it's just an hypothesis. But it's interesting to build hypotheses, because in some way, if you want to understand the world better, you have to make hypotheses. So let's say, for example, in the early days, people will see the sun rise and then the sun set, and they started to formulate some hypotheses. Maybe the earth is round, and Maybe the sun goes around the earth, or the earth goes around the sun. Both initially were valid hypotheses. Then eventually one hypothesis was disconfirmed, and turned out it was the earth going around the sun. In some way, we advance in our thinking through hypotheses, because if you never make an hypothesis and you just look at facts, well, facts don't mean much if you don't attempt to make an hypothesis. So you could say we see a circle go up and down. It's like, I mean, let's use an example like a screen. So imagine that what we can see is like a screen. We can just say, well, it's just pixels. We just see pixels. But it's not very interesting. It doesn't try to help in any way to understand better what's going on. So an hypothesis is an attempt to try to understand a little bit better what is going on. So we see this round thing, which is the sun. It goes from bottom, it goes up, and then it goes down, it disappears. And maybe eventually someone started to think, well, maybe this thing is similar to Earth. It's kind of a big round thing. And maybe it turns around the Earth. And then someone say, well, maybe Earth turns around it. And then at least they have two hypotheses, which is better than having zero hypotheses. So a hypothesis is not a story. A hypothesis is a hypothesis, something that maybe is, and it's interesting to think about it, to look at it, and to try to understand the implications of what if it's the case, and to try to find alternative competing hypotheses, and then to see which one seems to make the most sense. And maybe we have to keep multiple hypotheses, and eventually there will be some data that will confirm one or the other, but we may have to keep multiple hypotheses for a very long time. There is this idea, this question that humans have always been asking, like since basically forever, like, is there life after death? Now, again, what does it mean, life after death? I mean, life, if life is you're alive, and well, then in theory, no, because if you're dead, there is no life. So the question is already confusing, because it depends what we mean by death, death of what, and it depends what we mean by life, and it's complicated, but it's just a confusing question. It's probably not very interesting. So I try to approach the question from a different perspective, from the perspective of potential. So potential, let's say, for example, a tree exists as potential in the seed. So the tree doesn't exist yet, if the seed has not been planted and the tree has grown, but it exists as potential in the seed. The seed is the potential of the tree. So in some way, by looking, if we could look at the seed and know everything about the seed, maybe we could know what a tree is going to look like, potentially. So in general, anything that exists must have existed first as potential. So let's say, I mean, the Earth started existing, I don't know, maybe a few billion years ago. But in some way, the Earth existed as potential in the Big Bang. Even if it was not separate and manifest, etc., the Earth clearly existed as potential in the Big Bang. Because how can it exist now if it never existed as potential? Now, it's not clear what potential means, because potential could mean multiple things. It could be the seed that becomes the tree. It could be the Big Bang that becomes the Earth. It could be a lot of things. Potential, we could say, maybe some book from Shakespeare or whatever. I mean, Shakespeare writes it, but clearly it existed as potential somewhere in the mind of Shakespeare, and then in the DNA of the parents of Shakespeare, and in the DNA of their own parents, and everything that exists must have existed as potential first. It's just logical. So let's say a phone, a cell phone, is made of like glass and metal, etc., etc. Well, it existed as potential. So the glass was somewhere, some mineral. The metal was somewhere. The people that got the idea to build it were somewhere, and they had parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. So everything that exists existed as potential before. So it's just logical. Something cannot exist if it did not exist as potential, because the potential is what creates it. It emerges from its potential. So it exists as potential, and then it emerges from the potential. But before it can emerge from the potential, it must exist as potential. Even let's say, if we say, it is an example, but I think it's interesting. So let's say we say at some point there was nothing. There was absolutely nothing in the universe. Like even the universe maybe did not exist. Let's say there is absolutely nothing. But it's not completely true. Because one thing is if there is just, let's say, non-existence, or some absolute non-existence, but then it's just, it doesn't even exist. It's like lack of existence. And this clearly cannot exist, and I will explain why. But even if there is absolutely nothing, that nothing contains what can exist as potential. So even if, let's say, the universe is completely empty, but eventually something will exist, then that emptiness is not completely empty in the sense that it contains the potential for something to arise out of it, for something to manifest out of it, to come out of it. So it's not technically completely empty. It may appear empty, but if it becomes, let's say, our universe, our planet, and ourselves, then it's not completely empty because it still contains the potential of what is now. Whereas absolute non-existence, that is that not only it's empty, but there is also no potential whatsoever, this clearly cannot exist because something exists now. So whatever was the initial state, it must have had the potential for existence of something. So the initial state can be nothing, but nothing with the potential for something. It cannot be nothing with no potential for anything, because obviously there is something now, so it means it must have existed already as potential. So even if there was an empty universe, that empty universe already had the potential for everything we have now. So from that potential, whatever is now has arisen, has appeared, has manifested. If, however, the initial state was just emptiness without any potential, then nothing could have arisen out of it because there was no potential for anything. But that's impossible because we know that there is something. We are experiencing something, so there is something. So there was at some point the potential for this something. So the initial state can be maybe nothing, but nothing with some potential, with the potential for something, since something now exists. So anything that exists must have existed before as potential. And by the way, it may very well exist after as potential. So even if I burn my cell phone or I burn a book, that book could still reappear, it could still be recreated. So even if the universe gets destroyed, it could still reappear. If the initial state, I know it's a little bit philosophical what I'm saying, but it also has a logic. So if in the initial state the universe was completely empty, but it still had the potential to create something, even if the universe gets destroyed completely, let's say, it still has the potential to appear again, just like it appeared the first time. And maybe this is not the first time. Maybe the universe has already been created and destroyed trillions and trillions and trillions of times. But for sure, if there was an initial state, and it's an if, we don't know, if there was an initial state which was empty, that initial state had the potential to generate what we have now. And once what we have now gets destroyed, the potential to generate it again still exists. This is just logical. So I'm not pretending to know everything. I'm actually stressing the point that we know very, very, very little. The path to enlightenment is not about knowing, it's about removing what is false, it's about removing the stories that we make up in our mind that create this imagined reality that we then compare with the actual reality and we judge. But once we have removed the stories, we can think more clearly because our mind is not cluttered by those stories. And really the best we can do is formulate some simple hypotheses. Here we are not looking for truths or for absolutes or for whatever. This is nonsense. We are just trying to formulate simple hypotheses based on logic and maybe based on some experimental something, whatever. So let's look at the hypothesis then from the perspective of what could be the afterlife, whatever that means. So clearly, if I exist now, if I have been born, I must have existed at some point as potential, or I wouldn't exist now. I did not exist as potential before, then I wouldn't exist now. I guess that's logic. But we can also look more into detail. So it's like, who I am. That's, of course, a very difficult question to answer. I attempt to answer it in one of the videos where I talk about current experience plus future experience and a point of view that is inescapable. But I'm not going to spend too much time on this now. Let's just say that we don't know. I mean, who are we? We don't know. It's not that we need an answer to everything. Often the best answer is I don't know. So we don't know. We don't know what we are. But clearly something exists. Clearly we experience something. The point is not to manage to define in some incredibly absolute and truthful way what we are. We have no idea. No one knows. Because you cannot reach this absolute level of, let's say, cognition or knowledge to know everything. So we know a little bit. And based on this, we guess, we make hypotheses. We try to clean our mind from the stories and we make hypotheses. So who I am, who are we don't know. Yeah, we can make some guesses, we can make some small hypotheses, but the truth is we don't know. But it doesn't matter. We can still say we are something. We don't know what it is, but still we are something. At least we are experiencing something right now. So we must be something. So when I was born, when I was, let's say, 1 year old, yes, I existed as a 1 year old, and I was the potential for, let's say, me at 5 years old. And me at 5 years old was the potential for me at 10 years old. And me at 10 years old was the potential for me at 20. And me at 20 was the potential for me now. So I'm not the same person that I was when I was 20 and when I was 5 and when I was just born. Each step was the potential for the next. And I clearly existed as potential before I was born. I don't know exactly how and where, but I couldn't exist now if I had not existed as potential before. The potential is really just what comes before. So I existed as potential before I was born. And I existed as potential yesterday for me today. Me today is not the same as me yesterday. Me yesterday is the potential of me today, and me today is the potential of me tomorrow. The potential must always exist, and the potential is what later emerges and becomes something else. So I am me today, but I'm also the potential of me tomorrow. And let's say one day I will die and my body gets burned into ashes. Well, I mean, no one knows what happens, for sure. We have no idea. We can just guess, we can make hypotheses. But if I have existed once, it means before I existed as potential. And so if my body gets destroyed, I have still existed potential at some point. It's not that this potential disappears. The potential doesn't really disappear. So it's like there is the potential to do something one time, 2 times, 100 times, 1,000,000 times. The potential stays. So there is the potential for me. Then let's say I get destroyed, but the potential still exists. So I may very well appear again. Now, what is going to be that me? Is it going to be me? What is identity? I mean, no one really knows. But again, we are just trying to formulate some hypotheses. We are not trying to find perfect answers. Those are like baby steps. So baby steps of a very simple logical analysis, which is if we exist now, then we existed as potential before. If we cease to exist, the potential still exists, so we may very well exist again. Now, in which shape or form or how, no one has any idea. But if the potential was there in the first place, and it then manifested in us, why couldn't this happen again? Just like the full universe. So if initially there was nothing but the potential for a universe, then this potential manifested into the universe could very well then get destroyed and then recreated and destroyed and recreated, etc., etc. It doesn't have to be the same universe, but it's still the result of the same potential. Now, some people want to call it soul or spirit or whatever, but that's irrelevant. Those are meaningless words. We don't really understand what they mean. For sure, there is an element of potential. Something always exists as potential before it actually exists. And so if it gets destroyed, it probably still exists as potential. And if it exists as potential, it can probably keep manifesting or emerging from the potential an infinite number of times. Now, is it going to be exactly the same? Is it going to be slightly different? Is it going to be completely different? What is it going to be exactly? We don't know. But still, the potential is there. The potential does not get destroyed once the way in which it manifests gets destroyed. So let's say the idea of a triangle. So a triangle is an idea. So let's say, or we can say it's the potential for an idea. So does the triangle exist before it gets discovered? It's a big question. I mean, the triangle exists as a potential idea that eventually someone will have. Or let's say Harry Potter or some book of Shakespeare. They exist as a potential idea until someone gets the idea. And it's obvious because, I mean, of course, more complicated things do not get invented independently. So there is only one Shakespeare, but because there are just so many letters, there are just so many books you can write. But if we look for something simple, like let's say a triangle. So let's say a triangle is a simple idea. Let's say three sides of equal length is an equilateral triangle. Eventually, some human will come up with this idea, say, oh, nice idea, the triangle. But the idea is simple enough that maybe different civilizations will come up independently with the idea of the triangle. It's not one person has to invent the triangle and communicate it to another person. Because the idea is simple enough that a new civilization can independently come up with the idea of the triangle. If there are alien civilizations, they for sure have come up with the idea of the triangle also. It's not that only we come up with the idea of the triangle, even without communication. So the idea of the triangle is simple enough that different civilizations can come up with the idea of the triangle independently. So it means the idea of the triangle exists already as potential. Of course, it's a simple one, but then even the more complicated one, like the book of Harry Potter or a movie or whatever, they also exist as potential before they exist. Now the question is, can they, however, be discovered independently? Well, because the degree of complexity is very high, it's very unlikely. But if you consider a very large universe, like billions and billions of galaxies, with billions and billions of solar systems, with plenty of planets that are potentially inhabited by alien civilization, and you consider an infinite amount of time, and you consider maybe an infinite number of parallel universes, well then yes, then probably Harry Potter, Shakespeare, and the triangle will all arise independently. Someone will come up with the idea independently, because the idea exists as potential. We can use as a metaphor a very large number. So let's say the number 3. The number 3 is a small number. We can say that it exists as potential, and many civilizations will come up with the idea of the number 3 independently, because there are not that many options. Let's say from 0 to 10, there are 10 possibilities. So, I mean, it's stupid what I'm saying, but the point is, it's quite obvious to come up with the idea of the number 3. It's just one digit. So many civilizations will independently come up with the idea of the number 3. But then let's say that I write a very long number. I write a number like 1, 3, blah, blah, blah. I write a number which is a million digits. Now, by just writing random numbers, so I just write a million random numbers, and I get a number which is a million digits. Now, the odds that someone else can guess this number is very low. It's an extremely low number. It's almost impossible. Almost, I'm saying, yeah, not impossible. It's almost impossible that someone is going to guess that number independently, unless I give them the number. Then they can replicate it. It's like a password, basically. So if you tell if you tell your password to someone, they know the password. If you don't tell the password, well, they could still potentially guess it, but it's unlikely. So this will be like a very long password. So it's a number that is made of a million digits. Each one is random. And let's say I come up with the idea of that number. Now, do I expect that someone else will independently come up with that same number? No, it's too unlikely. But if it was 2 numbers, let's say my password is 2 numbers, it's like 36. Well, then I would expect that potentially someone can guess it. Or if my big number was just 36, well, many people could come up with the idea of, let's say, their favorite number is 36. So if I say, what's my favorite number? It's 36. Okay, great. So a lot of people may independently come up with a favorite number, which is 36. But if my favorite number is 1,000,000 random digits, no one will come up with the same. Almost. If we only look at Earth. But if we consider trillions of galaxies, maybe infinite number of universes, an infinite amount of time, and many civilizations in every galaxy, it is possible. It's just a matter of how big is your sample. So it's like, yes, the number is a million digits. But if we have trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of galaxies and civilizations, etc., then maybe someone else will also come up with the same random number independently. So in some way, everything exists as potential, whether it's very small or very big. Of course, the bigger it is, the more attempts you need to guess it. But in theory, even a long number that is 1,000,000 digit can be produced spontaneously by more than one person without having to interact. If you have enough people, you must have a very large number of people that each one try to guess this number. So when it's very simple, like the triangle or a 1-digit number or 2-digit number, even on our planet itself, it can happen. So 2 people may come up with the number 36. Just like if passwords were just 2 digits, lots of people will come up with the same passwords. But if passwords were like 1,000,000 digits, then probably nobody will come up with the same password. But if we had many more people, if we had trillions and trillions and trillions of people, then once in a while, 2 people will come up with the same password, even if the password was 1,000,000 digit. So in some way, everything already exists as potential, because in order to exist at some point, it must exist as potential first. But if you delete that number, let's say it's a big file of 1 megabyte, so you have this file with 1,000,000 random numbers, you delete that file. Well, of course, it may be difficult to recreate it, but difficult doesn't mean impossible. In theory, if you try all the combinations from 1,000,000 zeros to 1,000,009, it's a lot of combination, but eventually you will get it back. So over enough attempts, even if you destroy it, it will come back because it still exists as potential. Everything that exists already exists as potential, including us. So before existing, we must have existed as potential. And even if we cease to exist, we may very well exist again because the potential is still there. Now, of course, it requires a very large sample, but we don't know what is the size of the universe. And it doesn't even mean that it has to be exactly us, because it's not clear what makes us us. We don't really know. So it's like at the end, probably each molecule in my body is different than when I was 1 year old. I am made of the food I ate in the last 40 years. So I'm not really the same as when I was 1 year old, but still I kind of consider that I am roughly the same. So it doesn't have to be exactly the same. Just like, let's say, the Mona Lisa. So you want to preserve the Mona Lisa. You can take a picture, and you can take another picture and another picture. And every picture will be slightly different. It will not be exactly the same pixels. If you use a computer, if you take 2 pictures, like you put the Mona Lisa in front of you, and you take one picture with a high-resolution camera, and then you instantly take another picture in exactly the same condition. Pixel by pixel, if you compare pixel by pixel, the color of every pixel, there will be some differences. You cannot get the same photo twice. Well, I mean, of course, if you try an infinite amount of time, yes. But if you do it 2 or 3 times, every photo will be different. So if you take the Mona Lisa and you make different pictures of the Mona Lisa, every picture will be slightly different. But still, you will accept that all of them are the Mona Lisa. You will say, yes, if I compare them with a computer, with an algorithm to compare pixel by pixel, those are different photos. But they are all photos of the Mona Lisa. So we will recognize the similarity. We will recognize that those are photos of the Mona Lisa. So we have kind of preserved the integrity of the Mona Lisa. So I am the same me as yesterday? Well, not exactly, because I ate some food, I went to the bathroom, so I released some molecules from yesterday. I acquired new molecules. My bird has grown a little bit. Like certain transformation have happened in my body, in my brain, etc. I'm not exactly the same as yesterday, but I'm roughly similar. I still feel I'm the same. even if I know it's not completely true. So it's not really clear what makes us us. It doesn't have to be exactly the same. So again, with the Mona Lisa is the Mona Lisa. If you want to preserve it and you take pictures, every picture is going to be slightly different. But still you agree that they are all pictures of the Mona Lisa. So in some way it's not clear what is the Mona Lisa, what makes the Mona Lisa the Mona Lisa. To what extent you can change the Mona Lisa and it's still the Mona Lisa? Can you slightly change the eyes, the nose, the hair? Can you change the colors a little bit? To what extent can you change the Mona Lisa and it's still the Mona Lisa? It's not clear. We don't know what makes the Mona Lisa the Mona Lisa. We don't know. Of course, the extremes are obvious. If the photo is the same, it's still the Mona Lisa. And if we just cover it with white and there is nothing left visible, it's not the Mona Lisa. But so for the extremes, it's obvious. If you burn the Mona Lisa and there is just ashes, you will say that's not the Mona Lisa. Or again, if you paint it with white color and nothing is visible, you will say that's not the Mona Lisa. But if you make small changes, is it still, is it not? We don't know. I am still me. Was I still me when I was 12? There are major differences. But it's not completely different either. It's kind of in between. So we don't know exactly what makes us us, whatever us means anyway. We don't know. But clearly we know that for something to exist, it must exist as potential first. If the thing gets destroyed, the potential still exists and it could very well emerge again into something. And it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly the same. It cannot be completely different, but it doesn't have to be exactly the same. And there is probably a huge range. There are many ways in which you could change the Mona Lisa and it's still the Mona Lisa. And at some point, the Mona Lisa existed as potential in the mind of Da Vinci. And Da Vinci himself existed as potential maybe in the DNA of his parents. And all the way back to the Big Bang, everything that we experience now existed as potential in the Big Bang. And even if the universe gets destroyed, there could very well be a new Big Bang, and the stuff that has been destroyed could re-emerge again, maybe in a different way. But given enough time, given enough combination, given enough iterations, everything that can exist in potential will eventually exist an infinite number of times, given, of course, an infinite duration.